Famous linguist asked Maid's black daughter to translate a rare language. Unaware she's a genius, the auditorium shimmered beneath golden lights. The kind reserved for scholars who believed brilliance only belonged to those with polished shoes and prestigious last names. Every seat was filled, professors, journalists, and students murmuring over research that promised to reshape history. At the far end, where the marble floor reflected those lofty ambitions, Maria Alvarez knelt with her cleaning cloth, wiping away footprints no one cared to see. No one noticed her, except the girl who entered quietly through the side door, clutching a folder too big for her trembling hands. Isabella Alvarez. Her steps echoed differently, not with confidence, but with the weight of a dream she was never expected to carry. Conversation slowed. Eyes turned, some curious, others amused. Dr. Richard Coleman leaned toward a colleague, lips curling into a faint smile. "The janitor's daughter is presenting research today?" he whispered, as if mocking the very idea could protect his ego. The remark drew polite laughter, the kind that hides cruelty behind intellect. Maria looked up from the floor just in time to see her daughter step onto the stage. Pride and fear warred in her eyes. She had spent her life cleaning halls that were never built for people like them. Yet today, her daughter stood in front of the same walls, not to clean them, but to rewrite what they represented. And no one in that hall knew that the girl they had dismissed was about to change the history of language forever. The south side of Chicago never promised comfort. It was a place where dreams had to fight their way through cracked pavements and flickering streetlights. In a small apartment above a grocery store, Maria Alvarez folded uniforms at midnight, her fingers raw from detergent and exhaustion. 2 jobs barely paid the bills, but they kept her daughter's education alive. Isabella studied by the dim light of a second-hand lamp, her books stacked taller than the table that held them. Each page she turned carried the same silent vow, to rise above the walls that surrounded her. While other teenagers scrolled through their phones, Isabella traced faded symbols from a notebook that most scholars would have thrown away without a second glance. That notebook had come from the university's trash, a forgotten relic from a retiring linguist. Maria had found it while cleaning his office, its pages torn, its edges yellowed with time. She had almost tossed it aside until she noticed the delicate handwriting inside, symbols that looked like songs caught on paper. She brought it home, thinking her daughter might enjoy the mystery. From that night, Isabella changed. The girl who once struggled with math now stayed awake until dawn, whispering strange words under her breath. She filled notebooks with sketches and translations, mapping connections that no one else could see. The language inside the discarded book was not dead to her. It was sleeping, waiting for someone who cared enough to listen. Maria would sometimes wake at 3 in the morning and find her daughter still studying, eyes heavy, lips moving as she compared symbols with ancient African and South American dialects. "You need to rest," Maria would say softly, placing a blanket over her shoulders. Isabella would only smile and whisper, "Just a little longer, Mama. I think I almost understand it." Every translation was a small victory, every rejection letter a fresh wound. Isabella sent her findings to professors and research centers across the country. Most never replied. Those who did laughed politely, suggesting she focus on something more realistic. One response had stung more than the rest. A professor wrote, "Theoretical linguistics is not for cleaning families. Try something practical." Maria never saw her daughter cry that night, but she noticed the silence that followed. Yet when the sun rose, Isabella was already back at her desk, eyes red but hands steady. The girl refused to stop. Winters came harsh and unforgiving. Their apartment walls leaked cold air, and the heater often broke down. Maria worked late shifts at the university, emptying trash bins while professors discussed theories she could never afford to study. Sometimes she overheard names, conferences, research grants, discoveries. She understood little, but one name began to echo everywhere: Dr. Richard Coleman, the rising star of linguistic studies. Maria had cleaned his office too. She had seen how he treated students, the confident ones he praised, the quiet ones he ignored. She never imagined that one day her daughter's name would appear beside his. Isabella's determination began to draw small ripples of attention. An online linguistics forum picked up her post comparing indigenous Brazilian dialects with African root languages. A visiting researcher from Cambridge replied, asking for her notes. It was the first time someone treated her work seriously. But with hope came sacrifice. Maria sold her wedding ring to buy a used laptop. They skipped meals to afford high-speed internet for Isabella's research. On some nights, Maria would stare at the dark ceiling and whisper a prayer she had repeated for years. Let her be seen. Let her be heard. 4 years passed like that. The same girl who had once Saturday, kitchen table surrounded by bills, was now invited to, present at a national linguistics conference. The same university whose trash had given her the notebook that started it all. When the invitation letter arrived, Maria held it as if it were made of gold. They finally know your name, she said, her voice trembling. Isabella smiled, but there was fear behind her excitement. They know my name, Mama, she whispered, but they still do not know where it came from. And now, standing inside the Grand University of Chicago auditorium, surrounded by professors who once doubted her very existence, Isabella Alvarez prepared to speak. The same world that once closed its doors on her was now waiting to hear what she had to say. Under the bright auditorium lights, Isabella Alvarez stepped up to the podium. The vast hall, once filled with murmuring voices and tapping pens, fell into an uneasy silence. Rows of scholars from Cambridge, Harvard, and across Europe sat watching, their expressions hovering between curiosity and disbelief. They saw not a rising researcher, but a girl who did not belong there, the daughter of the cleaning woman sweeping their marble floors. At the back of the hall, Maria Alvarez stood half-hidden behind a curtain, clutching her work gloves in trembling hands. Her eyes never left her daughter. For years she had imagined this moment. But now, the weight of the world pressed on both their shoulders. The conference had already been long. One professor after another presented graphs and theories that blurred together. Words like syntax mapping and lexical drift filled the air, but there was no soul in them. Then came Isabella's name on the screen, and the room suddenly woke up, though not with respect. Whispers ran across the audience. Is that the janitor's daughter? She's on the list? How? Dr. Richard Coleman leaned back in his chair, a thin smirk curling at the corner of his lips. This should be entertaining, he murmured to his colleague. Isabella stood before them, her notes trembling slightly in her hand. She took a breath and began, her voice quiet but steady. For years we have believed that the Arawan language family of the Amazon had no surviving branches. But what if it did? The projector flickered to life, showing old maps, fragments of symbols and translations scribbled in her own handwriting. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, soft, dismissive. Yet Isabella pressed on. She spoke of an ancient notebook found abandoned in a university basement. She described the delicate grammar it contained, the poetic rhythm hidden in its verbs, the possibility that it shared roots with indigenous tongues still spoken today. Her words carried a rhythm that no one expected, not dry academic speech, but a story. A discovery. A heartbeat. As she layered example after example, the laughter faded. Eyes began to narrow, not in mockery, but in interest. Pens lifted. Screens lit up as scholars started taking notes. She was not just presenting data. She was reviving something that had been silenced for centuries. Dr. Coleman could not stand it. He raised his hand, voice sharp. Miss Alvarez, fascinating as your story is, are we here to discuss mythology or science? A few in the audience chuckled again, waiting for her to crumble. But Isabella turned to him with a calmness that silenced the room. Thank you, Dr. Coleman, she said softly. Science begins where arrogance ends. Gasps echoed across the hall. Coleman froze, his smirk vanishing. Isabella clicked to the next slide, a comparison of ancient syntax with modern Arawan dialects. The patterns matched perfectly. She continued, each word growing stronger, her voice steady, clear, and undeniable. Her mother watched, her eyes glistening with tears. In that moment, Maria no longer saw the little girl she once walked to school in the rain. She saw a woman standing in a hall of giants, not begging to be seen, but forcing the world to listen. The murmurs turned to silence. The smirks faded into stunned faces. Scholars leaned forward, realizing they were witnessing something that could rewrite linguistic history. Dr. Richard Coleman leaned forward, his patience finally cracking. Enough, he said sharply, his voice cutting through the silence. You expect us to believe that a student with no funding, no official mentorship, and no access to field research just happened to uncover what decades of scholars could not? The words hung heavy in the hall. The crowd stirred uneasily. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked at Isabella, waiting to see if she would crumble under pressure. Isabella adjusted the microphone and looked straight at him. "With respect, Dr. Coleman," she began quietly, "I never said it was easy. But sometimes truth hides in places where pride refuses to look." Her calm tone only seemed to provoke him more. Coleman stood up, waving a printed report in the air. "These recordings you claim to have used, where did you get them? Who verified them? Or should we assume you borrowed them from your friends in the janitorial staff?" Laughter broke from a few corners of the hall. Maria flinched where she stood near the back door, clutching her cleaning cloth tighter, her knuckles pale. But Isabella did not flinch. She turned toward the screen and clicked to the next slide. "You are correct, Dr. Coleman. Verification matters." Her voice grew steadier. "So I did what no one expected. I reached out to the Cambridge University Field Linguistics Department. They granted me temporary research access and provided me with digital copies of the archived field recordings from the 1930s. The room went silent again. Coleman blinked, caught off guard. "Cambridge," he repeated. "Yes," she replied simply. "And they also helped me carbon date 3 manuscripts I found in storage boxes that were marked as irrelevant by your own department 5 years ago." Whispers rose around the room, quick, sharp, uncertain. Several professors exchanged glances. One of them, an elderly linguist from Princeton, leaned forward and said softly, "Is that true, Dr. Coleman? Your department discarded those?" Coleman's lips tightened, but he said nothing. Isabella continued, her voice like quiet fire. "I spent 2 years analyzing every letter, every sound pattern, every fragment. What your team called folklore turned out to be one of the oldest linguistic bridges between indigenous South American dialects and pre-Columbian syntax. And the data was confirmed by Cambridge." A few in the audience began to clap softly, unsure but impressed. Coleman's face turned red. He took a step closer to the podium. "You manipulated that data," he snapped. "You have no credentials, no peer-reviewed publication." Before he could finish, a calm voice from the second row interrupted. "I reviewed her data," said a Cambridge researcher, rising to his feet. The hall turned toward him. "Everything checks out. The phonetic structures align. Her results are consistent with our own archives." The crowd murmured louder now, the shift in mood undeniable. Coleman's confidence wavered as more scholars whispered among themselves. Some nodded in approval. Others frowned, still skeptical. Maria's eyes filled with tears. She pressed the cloth to her lips, holding her breath. For years she had watched people dismiss her daughter. Now, she saw those same people struggle to keep their pride intact. Coleman's voice rose again, desperate. "Even if your analysis is correct, what makes you think you can rewrite linguistic history?" Isabella met his gaze and said softly, "Because sometimes the ones who clean up the dust see what the rest of you never look at." The room went silent once more. Her words carried more than defiance. They carried truth. Coleman's jaw tightened, but he had nothing left to say. The scholars who once smirked now stared at Isabella as if seeing her for the first time. And then she clicked one final slide, her tone quiet but firm. "Dr. Coleman," she said, "perhaps you will recognize this name." The screen lit up with an image that made every head in the room turn, and the name she spoke next ended every argument. The screen glowed softly behind Isabella as she took a slow breath. The hall had fallen completely silent. Every eye, every camera, every heartbeat in that vast room waited for her next move. She clicked to the final slide, and an old black and white photograph appeared on the screen, grainy, but filled with quiet dignity. A man in a worn suit stood beside a group of American anthropologists, his hands clasped behind his back, a notebook tucked under one arm. "This," Isabella said, her voice trembling with emotion, "is Isabella Alvarez, my great-grandfather." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Some leaned forward, others exchanged confused glances. Coleman frowned, his face pale. Isabella continued. "He worked as a translator for the North American Field Linguistics Expedition in the early 1900s. He was fluent in 7 dialects that were believed to be extinct today. But when he tried to publish his notes, his work was dismissed because of who he was, an immigrant laborer with no academic title. Her voice grew steadier, richer. Years later, those same notes were scattered and lost, until I found one of them, hidden in that discarded notebook from the university archives. I did not realize it then, but it was his handwriting. Gasps broke through the silence. She zoomed in on the slide, showing side-by-side comparisons of her great-grandfather's symbols and the language patterns she had reconstructed. The markings matched perfectly, ancient, intricate, alive again after more than a century. Coleman's jaw tightened. "You cannot be certain," he began, but the words came out hollow. Isabella interrupted softly. "I am certain, Dr. Coleman, because these are not just symbols. They are a legacy." She turned to the audience, pointing to her final piece of evidence. After verifying the manuscripts and the sound patterns, the Cambridge linguistics team confirmed that my reconstruction aligns with Maid Alvarez's field notes. And 3 days ago they sent me this. She clicked again. An email appeared on the projector, stamped with the Cambridge seal. The subject line read, "Confirmation of publication, joint authorship approval." The room erupted. Applause thundered across the auditorium as reporters raised their cameras. Scholars who had doubted her moments ago now stood to their feet. Some cheered, some clapped in disbelief, others simply smiled in awe. Maria Alvarez, standing at the far back, pressed both hands over her mouth. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She had dreamed of this moment through every cold night, every missed meal, every insult she had quietly endured. Her daughter had done what no one thought possible. Coleman sank into his seat, his face drained of color. The cameras caught his expression, the fall of arrogance into silence. Every whisper he had ever spoken about the janitor's daughter now echoed back at him like a judgment. But Isabella did not gloat. She stood still amid the applause, her hands resting lightly on the podium. She bowed her head for a moment, as if offering the triumph not to herself, but to the generations who came before her. The ones who cleaned, served, and were never seen. When she finally spoke again, her tone was gentle. "I thank you all, not for believing in me, but for listening. Because truth only asks to be heard." Her words settled like light across the room. Even the applause quieted, replaced by something deeper, respect. That day, history shifted, not because of power, but because of truth. Weeks passed, and the story of Isabella Alvarez began to travel far beyond the walls of the University of Chicago. Newspapers called it the rediscovery of a lost voice. Academic journals praised her for bridging a forgotten linguistic divide. Television anchors spoke her name with admiration, and online platforms filled with students quoting her words about truth and humility. For the first time in her life, Isabella walked through campus without feeling invisible. Professors who once ignored her now greeted her with respect. The university offered her a fellowship to continue her research, and Cambridge extended a formal invitation for her to join their linguistic preservation program in England. The day she received the letter, she found her mother in the same old janitorial closet where she had worked for years. Maria was folding her uniform neatly, ready for another long night. Isabella placed the envelope in her mother's hands. Maria opened it slowly, reading each line through her tears. "They want you in Cambridge?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "They want us, Mama," Isabella said softly. "You are coming with me." Maria tried to speak, but could not. She pressed her daughter's face into her hands and whispered, "You have changed our name, Isabella. You have given it honor." A month later, they moved into a small but warm apartment near the university grounds. The walls were plain, but to Maria it felt like a palace, a place where she no longer had to hide her hands from shame. Mornings were filled with laughter and quiet pride as Isabella prepared for her new role, while Maria tended to a little garden outside their window. Meanwhile, the academic world turned its gaze toward Dr. Richard Coleman, once untouchable, now isolated. His colleagues avoided him. Students whispered behind his back, and a disciplinary hearing loomed over accusations of professional misconduct. The arrogance that once defined him had evaporated. He was a man forced to watch his reputation crumble in the very halls where he once stood as a gatekeeper. Isabella, however, never mentioned his name again. She focused instead on what mattered, her work, her family, and the legacy that began long before her. One quiet evening, as rain tapped gently against the glass, Isabella sat at her desk writing her first official research paper. At the bottom of the title page, she paused before typing the dedication. Her fingers trembled slightly as she wrote the words she had carried in her heart for years. For my mother, Maria Alvarez. For every floor you cleaned, you cleared a path for me. Maria read the line later that night and wept softly, holding the printed paper against her chest. In that moment, the years of struggle no longer felt wasted. The world had finally seen what she had always known. Her daughter was meant to shine. And this time no one could ever take that light away. Months later, the grand lecture hall that once echoed with applause now sat silent. The seats were empty, the air heavy with memory. Dr. Richard Coleman sat alone in the front row, his posture bent, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen in front of him. On the screen, Isabella Alvarez stood at the university podium, speaking to a new generation of students. Her voice was calm and confident, her words carrying the quiet power of someone who had earned every syllable. I stand here not as someone who proved others wrong, she said, but as someone who believes that knowledge belongs to everyone, no matter where they come from or what title they hold. The audience in the video applauded. Coleman leaned back slowly, a flicker of regret passing across his face. He remembered the day he mocked her, the arrogance in his voice, the laughter that had followed. Now, as he watched her thank her mother before the world, something inside him shifted. My mother, Isabella said, smiling toward the crowd, taught me that dignity is not about status. It is about standing tall, even when the world looks down on you. Every dream I chased began with her faith. Coleman lowered his head, whispering to himself, she was right. His voice barely reached the walls, but it was enough. The truth had finally found him, not through humiliation, but through the echo of her grace. Outside, far from the city, Isabella and Maria walked along a dirt path through a quiet tribal village. Children ran around them, laughing, speaking words in the revived dialect Isabella had helped bring back to life. She recorded their voices carefully, preserving each story, each song, the sound of a culture reborn. Maria watched her daughter work, her eyes filled with pride. He would have been proud too, she said softly, thinking of Mateo Alvarez. Isabella smiled. He is, she whispered. As the sun dipped low, painting the horizon gold, the two women walked side by side, one carrying the wisdom of survival, the other carrying the promise of knowledge. And as the camera slowly faded, a soft piano note lingered beneath the closing line. Sometimes justice does not shout. It speaks quietly in the voice of truth. The image faded to sunlight, mother and daughter walking into it hand in hand.